Let's just open and introduce Jeff. So, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us again for the daily Hackorona webinar. Today we're with Jeff. Jeff is a Cloud Solutions Architect for Microsoft. I'll let Jeff to introduce himself. Today's session is going to be very, very interesting. So I encourage you to listen carefully. And thank you, Jeff. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us and in the Corona Hackathon as a mentor and as a speaker. So thank you very much for joining the effort and contributing to this amazing initiative. I'll hand it over to you. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Also, just if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, and we'll let Jeff know that about the questions.
All right, guys, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Today, I join you from home, obviously, from sunny Renana in Israel. I am a Cloud Solutions Architect, like Idan said. So what do? I work with Microsoft customers and partners to try to help them accelerate in their journey into Azure. I've been working in information technology in cloud for about the past 20 years, most of the time. If you can't tell by my accent, obviously in the United States. I moved to Israel about 2 years ago and started working for Microsoft at the same time. So since then, I have been living and breathing all things Azure, and I've had the great honor to work with a lot of great companies here in Israel and to see what's working really well for them and what's working not, and trying to close the gap. So today, as you can see what's on the screen, we're going to talk about Azure security concepts. There's going to be a lot of information here, but there's a special ending to this discussion, because I'm going to show you how to make things very, very easy for you, your CISO, and in general, your security operations team. So what we're going to talk about at a high level is taking your project from ideation to production while balancing out security. Okay, so quick agenda. We're going to go over some of the Azure security capabilities. After you see that, there's going to be probably more questions than answers. So then I'm going to let you know how you can start. We're going to talk a lot about Azure Blueprints, as well as the Azure Architecture Center, because those are your go-to locations for pretty much building anything in Azure when you want to think about well-rounded architecture and security. And while questions is listed last, please ask questions as we're going. As much as I like talking, I love teaching and helping too. So I want to make sure this conversation is working out for everyone involved. Okay, dimensions of Azure security. This is my disclaimer. Please be patient. There's going to be good news after this slide. So sit back, grab coffee, grab a beer, whatever helps you stay focused, because we're about to go through pretty much what's similar to the OSI stack. Starting out with physical. So what does physical mean? This is a data center. This is a building with computers in it. And just like a lot of companies still operate on-prem and operate their own data centers or rent colo space, Azure, just like other cloud providers, we have lots of data centers around the world. A lot of thought has to go into those data centers, not only for availability, redundancy, service levels, but also security. So as you can imagine, these data centers are very, very hardened facilities. We have to make sure that they pass lots of high-level compliance, so that way things like sovereign nations and municipalities, healthcare providers, everyone would feel comfortable hosting their data in our facilities. So as you can imagine, these are fortified facilities with lots of security around the physical side, as well as the logical that we'll get to. Things like cameras, biometric scanning, security guards, lots of audit and logging. I'm sure many of you have seen what a data center looks like. or maybe you've seen some on some cool TV shows or movies, so I'm going to move on. So one of the most fundamental things that sits inside of a data center is the network, essentially the fabric that's going to connect everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and touch on a few of these topics now, just to let you know what's in this. Some of these things may or may not come up for your specific architecture. Some of these things will be handled for you by Microsoft Azure, and some of these things will be well within your responsibility. So first of all, by default, for the past bunch of years, all Azure networks are protected by a base level of distributed denial of service protection. So as long as you are functioning within the Microsoft Azure network, your services, whether they're PaaS, SaaS, or IaaS, have a fundamental level of protection for denial of service. Network security groups. So just like if you think of any virtual machine or even any physical server inside of your data center, you're going to want to make sure that hopefully that you're looking at traffic that's going in and out of that entity. Network security groups, it's essentially access control lists. So if you think of 5-tuple, source IP, destination IP, source port, target port, allow, deny. And we also have some fancy features in there for tagging specific functionality within the Azure environment to make life easier. Azure Firewall. So this is a pretty recent product which is really powerful. Some of the nice things that you can do with Azure Firewall, if you decide you don't have to use network security groups, and you can simply use routing to send everything to an Azure Firewall. While it's not as feature-filled as some of the higher end partner ecosystem network virtual appliances, you can do a lot with the Azure Firewall to secure your environment. In addition to that, you have the option inside of Azure Firewall to enable Microsoft Threat Intelligence. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but you're getting a lot more functionality out of these features than simply a 5-tuple allow, deny set of access control lists. The other thing too is it's also as a service. So the Azure Firewall essentially will expand and contract depending on your load, and you do not have to manage the hardware or software behind it. You simply are making use of firewall rules as a service. Web application firewall. So when you think of how are you protecting your APIs, most developers that are listening in or may watch this recorded content, you're exposing APIs. And while you might be exposing them hopefully using HTTPS, so it's secured, how do you know that what is traveling inside of your payload is secure? Is it going to be passing the common standards for OWASP to make sure that you are not securely injecting into your API endpoint bad traffic? So we offer a web application firewall as a service that basically makes use of the OWASP up to 3.1 now. And of course, you can go into those individual settings and you can you can turn off specific features if they're creating false positives. But in general, it's a great service. Again, as a service, you don't have to stand up any hardware or software. You simply enable the service and you configure it. Service endpoints. This is a great conversation around keeping your integration points secured. So if you imagine, let's say 5 years ago, when lots of cloud providers were providing really great PaaS services, such as storage as a service or SQL as a service, database as a service. By the nature of these globally distributed systems, these are all externally accessible service offerings. You can get to them using some sort of external DNS name, an A record, a C name, whatever. At the end of the day, it's out there on the internet. As things evolved, we started allowing the injection of these services transparently within your virtual network. So once you build your VMs, once you turn on some of your internal services, whether it's containerized systems inside of your virtual network, those systems are likely going to need to talk to backends for stateful data, whether it's databases, whether it's blob storage to store media or different content. You now have the ability, without modifying any code, to enable endpoints. And there's some automagical stuff that's happening in the Azure Fabric that recognizes the traffic that is intended for other internal Azure services, and it'll keep that private inside of the Azure network. So really cool feature. It's pretty much a checkbox to enable it, and your traffic will be private. Another really cool thing is private endpoints and links. So service endpoints were a great start. However, that didn't do much good if you operate a hybrid infrastructure, which most companies do. You have your legacy or even current on-prem systems that are connected to the cloud, in this case Azure, but you cannot privately make use of those service endpoints because your traffic is not originating inside of Azure. So what private endpoints allows you to do, it allows you to give things like Azure storage a real living and breathing IP address on your virtual network. While that is also really cool for systems in Azure, that means if you have systems on-prem that are going over some sort of private link to Azure, you can hit an IP address that's given to you that will expose those services. So guess what? Now you can do things like have Azure storage, whether it's Azure file shares or Azure blob storage. Those will truly be privately accessible endpoints that will stay within the perimeter of your network. So it's a really great option. The other awesome thing that you can do, I'm working with a bunch of our ISV partners, you can expose your APIs privately to other customers on Azure, even if they're not in your subscription, even if they're not even in your geography. So basically, you take your API, you expose it as a service, and another customer can essentially hit a local IP address that gets provided to them on their network, and that is going over the Azure backbone to the SaaS provider or partner service. So again, it's a really cool feature to prevent you from having to expose your APIs out to the wild on the crazy internet. It's something that's picking up a lot of steam because there are a lot of SaaS providers out there that are building on Azure. And again, this allows them to privately expose the services to other Azure customers. Service firewall. Something that goes really nicely with service endpoints and private endpoints is service firewalls. So things like Azure SQL, Azure Storage, and many, many other services, you are capable now to limit the traffic that is reaching the endpoints of those storage systems and those SQL databases. So what you can do, as an example, if you're using service endpoints or private endpoints for your Azure storage, and now it's privately accessible on one of your networks, you can actually set up the service firewalls to prevent external access or to allow whitelist only. So you really have now turned your cloud storage into something that's more classified as a local storage endpoint. So as you can see, I'm going over some of these security services in special order to really show you how you can go from broad exposure and really start tightening the accessibility. ExpressRoute, this is basically, this allows you to have private WAN connectivity into Azure from your on-prem. This also allows you to have guaranteed and service level backed connections into Azure for bandwidth and latency. With virtual WAN, this also gives you a chance to think of a hub and spoke, and you have many different branch offices. You want to have them all come together to a specific entry point into Azure. You can enable that with virtual WAN. So at that point, all of your on-prem and all of your branch offices, think of them as the spokes, and you're essentially using Azure as the hub. There are many security services that you can put inside of that hub, and you can really centralize and control a lot of your traffic. VPN, Nothing special there. The main difference between VPN and ExpressRoute, VPN is going over the public internet. You are required to maintain your service levels with your ISP at that point. If people are browsing a lot of Netflix, as we're all doing nowadays, you will not have guaranteed connectivity, and you will be experiencing all the rainstorms that are happening right now on the public internet. So I've seen lots of companies use VPNs instead of ExpressRoute, and if there is traffic that's unexpected, whether it's on your side or with your ISP, there really isn't much you can do about it. Partner ecosystem. For most of the services I just spoke about, we also have a very large partner ecosystem with companies that you've heard of, such as Checkpoint, Fortinet, Palo Alto, and the list goes on for network virtual appliances, WAF providers like Radware. So we work very well with all of these providers, and we have a very rich partner ecosystem. One of the benefits there, let's say you're not a born in the cloud company, let's say you have a large on-prem footprint, and you also have all the operations already for some of these partners that I mentioned. Most of these exist as virtual appliances that you can enable inside of Azure. So as far as your SecOps and your IT operations goes, it's simply another endpoint for them to manage. You don't have to necessarily worry about adopting every new technology all at once. All right, deep breath. That covered network. There could be some other things I missed. I'm not sure if any questions came in while I was doing that. I'll give it 10 seconds and I'll move on to storage and data unless if I hear otherwise. Okay, storage and data. So on top of the network, we start thinking about different entities higher up in the stack. So think about storage as the information that you want to keep, the stateful data. By default, everything in Azure is secured by encryption at rest. And it is up to you, although it is default enabled for things to be encrypted in transit. So think of HTTPS, access to your blobs, your databases and whatnot, and all of that will be encrypted using industry standards. The other thing too, if you want to make use of Azure Files, which is basically sits on top of our storage subsystem, that can be exposed with SMB3. Another common thing that you'll see people doing with their blob storage is generate SAS tokens for specific periods of time. A lot of this stuff can be enabled programmatically for just-in-time access. Another really awesome feature that we have is the Azure Key Vault. So think of the Key Vault as if you use the app KeyPass or something similar on your phone. This is that app on steroids. So basically, it's a globally distributed vault where you can secure your secrets, your certificates, and basically there's a lot of programmatic access that you can lock down such that no one on the operation or the development side ever needs to store or even see those secrets. This simply get passed programmatically to different stages in your CI/CD lifecycle. This is also as a service. There's nothing for you to maintain. You simply start using it. And the Key Vault also is accessible by pretty much everything that's available on Azure at this point. So if anyone is still storing their passwords inside of config files, or even in some cases environment variables, you might not even need to anymore. I know that I've worked closely with different partners, and they've decided to take everything that has to do with secrets and certificates out of the deployment, and everything is completely programmatic now. So no one has to hold the keys to the kingdom anymore. Disk encryption. So while all of the content on Azure Storage is secured and it is encrypted, think of this as the operating system level. So you're in, think of the different volumes on your Linux VMs or the volumes on your or your C drive and your D drive on your Windows systems. We also support encrypting all of those volumes either with BitLocker on the Windows side or currently DMCrypt on the Linux side. And one really cool thing, you can enable that, and the keys are kept in Key Vault. So again, you don't have to, you don't have to worry about where you're storing these keys long term. This is all handled inside of Key Vault. I'm just listing out some examples of our database platforms where you can also do some, higher up in the stack encryption. Of course, with things like SQL, you're still going to worry about your row level protection, your transparent encryption, but underneath that storage is still encrypted. So you can almost consider that as 2 layers of encryption. The container registry, that's another place where you're going to be storing encrypted information, such as your different container images. And I'm going to pause there, and we're moving up the stack. Don't worry, everyone, we're really getting there. I know this is a lot, but the good news is this is all very much simplified for you in the next few slides. So you don't have to build it from scratch. Don, is anyone still awake? Are you awake?
All
right. Any questions, or we're good?
So far, but
any questions?
We're good.
No, we're good. No questions in the comments.
Nothing there?
Nope.
Okay. I'm going to take that as everyone understands or is sleeping. Okay, so now we're moving up the stack. So we're going to talk about some of the fundamental, more compute level services that we have in Azure. So of course, we have the classic IaaS, container as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So all of these platforms, have security capabilities built into them, depending on which one that you're dealing with. Workplace, of course, if you think of things like Teams or Office 365, Power Platform, Windows Virtual Desktop, there are lots of security capabilities that you need to worry about with those services as well. We have guides for everything, but again, if you don't pay attention to the next few slides, that can be pretty challenging. We also have the capability for application proxy, where even for some of your on-prem legacy systems, even now as we're talking about the coronavirus and people working from home, do you just want someone VPNing in and having full access and being able to copy information in and out? With application proxy, you can safely protect access even without a VPN into those systems. And that leads into identity. So while a lot of things that we spoke about before have to do with network level, well, identity is the new perimeter. And simply protecting your network and even encrypting your storage, that might not get you, because if someone is logged in as a real legitimate user, you have a problem. So of course, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Azure Active Directory. So that's our globally available directory as a service. We have lots of higher end features in Azure Active Directory that tie into many other systems. So also, close this window. Okay, so also multi-factor, that's kind of the most obvious thing that you want to be doing, especially now that entire workforces are working from home. Turn on multi-factor authentication. It will, you may not know when it's going to save you, but there are enough stories out there where I don't have to talk much more about it. It's simple to enable and just use it. So service principals. Inside of Azure Active Directory, in addition to users and groups, you also have the capability to assign service principals to objects, such as a virtual machine. So if you think about it, imagine you have some build machine that's running. No one can access that build machine, but how do you pass it credentials? And let's say you're not doing something with Key Vault, or you have some legacy application. You have the capability to assign that virtual machine itself an actual identity in Active Directory, and go ahead and assign capabilities to it within other services inside of Azure. And that way, you don't even have to manage any users. If you have something that's securely operating on that virtual machine or on that build machine, it can have downstream access, and there's nothing for you to manage at that point. Of course, you want to be very careful with that VM itself, but conditional access, another really important thing for people to think about nowadays. No one's traveling, no one's going anywhere right now. So if you imagine someone logging into your Azure portal, or even any of the other systems that are listed here, on the screen, it probably wouldn't make sense for, for someone here in Israel to be simultaneously logging in from Tel Aviv, and oh, by the way, they're logging in from China or the United States or someplace in Europe. So conditional access can look for things like this, and you can really lock down additional capabilities, or you can be much more restrictive for what users are doing, what kinds of devices they're logging in from, where they're logging in from, IP address ranges, and the list goes on. And this is also where we get into identity protection. So we have security capabilities where, things like, is your user principal or your login, does that exist someplace also on the dark web? Has your password been exposed? And we can go ahead and proactively make you aware and block that access. Privileged identity management. This is a great activity for system administrators. During the day, you might not want to be carrying out standard operating procedures using the same login that you're checking your Outlook with. So you can go ahead and elevate yourself, and that's all controlled and audited. B2C, this is awesome, especially nowadays with a lot of the apps getting built. You probably don't want to have millions of users of your application that you built on Android and iOS sitting inside of your Azure Active Directory as first-class citizens. So you can actually create a B2C directory where you're essentially managing the logins separately from your true corporate directory. And it also allows for seamless sign-on with other identity providers, whether it's Salesforce, Facebook, the list goes on. Another big thing, password lists. So, if you think about managing passwords, we've all done it and we've all heard the stories about it. You have, 100 different logins that you have to manage. Probably most of those, unless if you're really, really diligent with using a password safe, they're going to have the same password. So going passwordless, you think about something like logging into the Azure portal or logging into your applications, and then you're going to go ahead and you are going to, okay, that's a kid, big surprise. So you're going to go ahead and log in, and then an app on your phone, Microsoft Authenticator, will go ahead and ask you if that's a legitimate login or not. So at that point, you're not managing any password. You're simply using the capabilities.
Wait.
Okay. No, not done yet. Almost, guys. Close the door. Okay. AD Connect. So Azure Active Directory is awesome, but you probably, if you've been around for more than a few years, you probably already have a directory called called Active Directory. You want to connect those two. And not only does it allow you to unify, your databases so you don't have double entries for people, but you can bring the advanced functionality that I spoke about with Azure Active Directory, and you can overlay that on top of your on-prem Active Directory. Finally, we have RBAC. So using your entities inside of Azure Active Directory, you can assign permissions across pretty much everything inside of Azure to control who's accessing what, with, of course, logging and auditing. I'm going to pause for 1 second, and then we're going to talk about secure operations. All right. Yeah, I need a drink after that. Okay, so let's say you build an awesome system, and you're so confident that you did all the right things. Now you have to maintain it. Things don't tend to be as awesome and pretty as they are after day one, and things drift over time. So Microsoft Azure provides a lot of different types of tool sets in a very centralized way, so you can have a great situational awareness of current and state over time. So Azure Security Center will essentially be your dashboard where you're able to get a situational awareness and assessment of the state of all of your entities, not only inside of Azure, but you can also deploy agents so that way you can maintain that same awareness and control over other cloud providers and over your on-prem for hybrid IT. Security Center allows you to install many different policies, so that way you can audit and be alerted for deviations. And there's an ever-growing list of items that you can create remediations for. So, for instance, if you're missing, if your network security groups on one of your VMs are too wide and you're allowing SSH inbound from the whole internet, that'll show up in Azure Security Center, and you will be able to remediate from there. So it's a great tool to look for vulnerabilities, even at the operating system level. And you can also take action for a growing number of entities inside of Security Center. The other thing too is you have a growing number of partner ecosystem providers that also send information to Azure Security Center. So more and more, it's becoming your central dashboard to see how things are going from a security perspective on your network. Azure Sentinel. So this is our SIEM as a service. Think of this as tying into the $1 billion that Microsoft invests every year in security, and the work of over 3,500 security professionals at Microsoft. Azure Sentinel ties into our threat intelligence, which is able to inform you of anomalous behavior, 0-day. There's also plenty of runbooks where you can create manual or automated responses to some of this activity. It's essentially command and control and allows you to perform forensics after the fact for situations that have happened on your network. Intelligent Security Graph. So this is essentially exposing all of the threat intelligence that Microsoft has via an API. So you can start querying this API to make decisions on different products that you want to develop on your own. This is a great feature. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel with coming up with your own ecosystem of threat intelligence. This security graph is based upon the billions of security signals that Microsoft is discovering and acting on every day. Audit logs, this might be self-explanatory, but everything that you do inside of Azure, from a RBAC, from a controlling the system perspective, this is going to show up in the audit logs. You cannot delete the audit logs. So if someone did something, and we've seen this many times, sometimes you might get a phone call, something may have accidentally disappeared or on purpose disappeared. This will show up in the audit logs and we'll let you know who did it and when. Log analytics. Think of log analytics as a great repository to send lots of your machine data, your logging data, pretty much anything that you want to configure. You can send your application data there. This becomes the clearinghouse for everything that reports up to Sentinel and Security Center. And of course, you can create lots of custom dashboards, logging and alerting on top of log analytics. This is also what allows you to export out to other partner providers. So we also have the capability to export out everything that you're seeing in log analytics. So that way, again, if your SecOps has a certain way of doing things, they can continue to do that even with Azure in the picture, because we can simply integrate with the partner ecosystem. Finally, DevOps. The main reason I'm bringing this up last, this is the last button that pops up, making sure that you're doing everything from a secure way. That can be great when you're whiteboarding and you're brainstorming, but it is so important to build this into your code and into your deployment practices. Sometimes people will build first and then code later, depending on what day of the week it is or what's going on with the weather. You never know if people are going to come back and automate and secure it with workflows and version control and CI/CD. So it is so important that all of these decisions that you're making, that you are turning them into X as code. You really have to codify these things, because this will allow for much better control later as you go. So I'm going to pause again, and then we're going to move on to the simple part of the discussion. I don't think that there are any questions so far. All right, so where do you start? Let's say you have an idea for a product, or you want to rebuild an existing system, of course you're going to come up with a plan, and you have to balance security with purpose. You want to be careful that you don't get carried away making something extremely secure and checking off every box. If for the life cycle of the product, it's not going to handle, personally identifiable information, or it's not going to be healthcare related. So just because you can make something extremely secure, you want to make sure that you should be doing it. And of course, the opposite holds true. You want to make sure that when you're designing something, you're securing it as much as required, and think about the evolution of that product. What would happen if you had to make it more secure? One thing which I've seen a lot of people do too is, start hardened and then retreat from it. So again, it's always easier to remove limits than to add them later. So this might seem at odds with the first bullet that I spoke about, but I'll say it like this, a very basic example. Imagine you have, two containers or two VMs or a PaaS service and the database that have to speak to each other. Lock those down as much as you can in the beginning, and then, look, as long as it doesn't become an endless circle, look for ways to open it up only as needed. This can save you a lot of problems later, whether it was accidental and you didn't clean up, or if you left an exposure that shouldn't have been there to begin with. Understand there's a shared responsibility. So if you think back to the pictures and the text that I was going over in the last slide, there are a lot of things that are done and provided by the Azure platform that are Microsoft responsibility. As you move from IaaS to PaaS and to SaaS, more and more of the responsibility of the management, the operations, and the security is on the provider, Microsoft. However, in all of those cases, you have the capability to make decisions and to make configuration changes, which could expose you to risk and data breach. And we've all seen the examples of all of those over time. So it's really a good idea. Again, when possible, stay as high up in the stack as you can. Don't build VMs if you don't need to. Don't even build containers if you don't need to. Stay as high up in the stack and focus on your core priorities, and let the security be handled for you as much as possible. The more security ownership that you take on, the more complicated it is. So I was hinting to this before, but just like there's infrastructure as code, you also want there to be security as code. So DevSecOps. Security is everyone's responsibility, but DevSecOps also focuses on, it's also the responsibility baked into your DevOps teams and your DevOps practices. So if you think about, whoever is writing your release pipelines, or even whoever is building your application code, if they're truly thinking about that from a security mindset, and they're aware and they're enabled and they're educated, you would hope in an ideal world that everything is just secure by default. Of course, that's not always true, and there's lots of reasons why that may be, but again, as early as you can, start building this into your mindset and your code and your deployments. This also leads us to the next big topic, which is this really enables you to go ahead and build security as code. So what are Azure Blueprints? Azure Blueprints are a set of essentially configuration content, which allows you to set specific guidelines that are either audited or enforced across your infrastructure on many different fronts. So I'm going to go through an example here for HIPAA. So probably one of the most stringent for healthcare. I'm going to switch my screen real quick. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what is an Azure Blueprint? So an Azure Blueprint, essentially it's a really big JSON file that has a list of control mappings. So let's say you want to build a brand new application, it's going to be servicing the healthcare industry. You might get a list hundreds of lines long from your security team saying, hey, great idea, let's go ahead and build it, make sure it meets all of these, make sure all these controls are met And oh, by the way, prove it to me. So the nice thing is, what Microsoft has done across not only HIPAA, but if you see here on the other side, we have NIST, PCI DSS, FedRAMP, Department of Defense, CIS, lots of different code that we've already built for you that can be deployed on top of your existing Azure platform. Of course, you have to test because this could lock down a lot of things for you. But each one of these samples has a control mapping where you're literally going through and across all the different criteria that are required by the different requirements, you can go ahead and see exactly what is being enforced and what isn't. The nice thing is you can provide a lot of this information to your security department, and this will check off a lot of the boxes for you to make sure that you're doing all the right things. And the other thing too is with Azure, you will get alerted, and you can also run reports to see how your environment is doing over time against these blueprints. So what enables this? Azure Policy. Azure Policy, again, it's not only those specific blueprints, you can also create your own custom policies to, something as basic as I don't want my information technology department to deploy certain size VMs, all the way up to I want to make sure that everyone's doing disk encryption. So there's a lot of customizations that you can do. Again, all of this gets audited, and you can create alerts for that. Again, compliance. It's a really big deal, as I'm sure a lot of people who've been in technology for a while, occasionally you might get audited, and you have to provide to the third-party auditor and to your security department proof that the way that you built the system is represents what's actually happening today. Again, we have lots of templates, so you really don't have to start from scratch. This can be a very scary topic. I've gone through this with many customers, and basically when they get the list from the security department, they're not really sure where to begin. And this really gets you a lot of the way there. Just like everything, this is in JSON. Use version control and deploy with CI/CD. You don't want to be handing something like policy documents in JSON to administrators for them to, basically manage outside of a version control system and a workflow. Again, these documents they do a lot of enforcement, and you have to be careful with how you deploy them. So of course, test. Last topic for today, Azure Architecture Center. So I know that many teams right now through Hackorona are going through their ideation processes now and trying to figure out what do they want to use to deploy. Do you want to use the Azure computer vision, or do you want to use another open source product? It can be a lot to discuss, and especially if you have a developer and then you have a data scientist and you have someone maybe who has more of an IT background, there can be a lot of white space in between their knowledge sets. So when you're coming up with any architecture, when you go to the Azure Architecture Center, you actually get deployable reference architectures. They're deployable because, again, we're going to be providing you in the Architecture Center samples, and of course you can go ahead and customize those samples. You don't have to start from scratch. You can decide to modify anything that's there. You can make it a lot more complex also and create multiple deployments. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly show you that website, which will show you all the different examples that we have. So again, when you hit the Azure Architecture Center, you have tremendous amounts of examples that you can go through. So as an example, let's say you want to, let's say you want to go through and do some advanced analytics or real-time fraud detection and whatnot. So we not only provide you the deployable use cases, but we talk through what's in there, why it's built that way, the different components that are in there with references to all the documentation. And at the end of it, you can go ahead and deploy. So These are really powerful. They were built by our product groups, partnering with real customer use cases. And again, there are hundreds of them in here. So of course it's searchable, but you don't have to sit from scratch and decide, how you want to expose an API, what backend you want to use. Is it better to use one solution versus another? There's a lot of the groundwork has been done for you, and a lot of the mistakes that have been made are rectified, and might as well use someone else's lessons learned than reinvent the wheel yourself. So here's another quick example. If you're looking at an architecture, where you're going to be ingesting different information from an RSS feed, there can be some text translation, computer vision, facial recognition. All of this can be deployed with a click of a button, and you can get your product to production that much quicker. All right, believe it or not, I am done speaking. I hope this was informative. There was a lot of information in here, and that was on purpose. In the beginning, I really wanted to, make people understand and aware that there are so many design considerations that you have to think about when you're thinking through security. And when you think of cloud, depending on how you operate it, it can be just as complicated as running your on-prem infrastructures. But we have a lot of help, whether it's through Azure Blueprints, Azure Architecture Centers. Of course, our CSAs like myself and Idan. But I'm going to open it up for any questions that anyone might have.
Come on, guys, that's your opportunity to ask questions. Okay. It's either everything is clear or they got into a completely mess.
You never know. It's always the gamble with having sessions with a lot of content.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah, it does a lot of content and a lot of information. So I guess it first of all, it's recorded, so people can go over it all over again several times until they'll digest all of the information you just spread out. So anyways, thank you very much, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to have you. You're really awesome. So thank you very much. And so don't forget to join us tomorrow. Tomorrow we have another interesting session about how can you leverage different technologies to work from home, like virtual, Visual Studio Code, and so on. So don't forget to join us tomorrow at the same place, the same time. We're gonna be here. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.